Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media. Mainstream media and international community have largely ignored the atrocities and genocide that is going on in my home country of South Africa. As economic refugees living abroad, we as independent media fight to expose the truth and find solutions for the many suffering and impoverished people still stuck in South Africa. This is Stop South African Genocide, hosted by Mel V and Karin Smith, live on CCN.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome once again to Stop South African Genocide, our scheduled broadcast here on Conscious Consumer Network. And it is 1 hour earlier than our normal time slot for the show because we are joined by a very, very, very special guest this evening. And before I go on to introduce Cuan Elgin and his amazing work, I want to say a big hello to my most esteemed co-host, Karin Smith. Hey, Karin. Just a brief intro on Cuan's work for those of you who aren't familiar. A very well-known South African writer, historian, and travel expert. Cuan Elgin works as a travel writer and consultant and has put out one of the most amazingly colorful works of, there we go, thank you, Karin. Bring that closer to the screen for us. Bula La, which is an absolute must-read for those people wanting to get to understand the beautiful, colorful history of South Africa and the dynamic landscapes that South Africa has. So, Cuan, before I get too much into this, I want to say, please just give a brief introduction to yourself and tell us a bit about your journey and how you've come to be here doing what you do.
Thank you, Mel. It's a pleasure to be on your show. And hello there, Karin. It's been a while. Well, I've spent my life pretty much in tourism development, game ranch management, safari lodges, that sort of thing. Done a bit of travel worldwide, but mostly in Southern Africa, mostly expeditions, that kind of travel, and got to know pretty much every corner of the region and its people. So I felt myself semi-qualified to write about it. I did a journalism course, funnily enough, in the middle of the Soweto riots in 1976. I had just come out of the army. We were conscripted in those days. I went in at age 17, so I was out at about age 19 for my first stint done. And then after that, we used to do camps every year, as we called it, mainly on the borders. And I did a journalism course, which was my baptism of fire, you could say, into what was a maelstrom in Johannesburg at the time. The Star newspaper is the biggest selling, or was then, English-speaking, English language paper in the country. I did my course there. Soweto is just down the road from Johannesburg, and for those who don't know, Soweto simply means southwestern townships, shortened version, and it was set up in the late 50s and early 60s by the nationalist government of the time, and they built what turned out to be pretty sturdy houses, which are still standing in reasonable condition compared to the ones the government is building now, the ANC, which fall down after a few years. But I got to see the Soweto riot.
We just need to say that we have a problem, as usual, with South African internet. Cuan's internet, which is usually perfect, is unstable tonight because he's talking to us. So we will have these interruptions, but he is well worth listening to. He is my favorite.
We were never indoctrinated into thinking we were in any kind of racial conflict. We were told we were going to be fighting communism, and that's what we did. And we held them at bay for the next 20 years. 25 actually, and eventually, of course, we had a democratic takeover by an essentially communist government. So although we won the war, we lost the peace.
Yeah, that was a very sad thing, Cuan, because we have a beautiful country. It is one of the most incredibly beautiful countries in the world. Mel and I are forever singing its praises because it's got everything. I mean, from snowy mountains in the Drakensberg where you can go skiing to the most beautiful beaches in the world. And both you and I have traveled and we've seen the beaches. So, and Mel is living on one practically at the moment, a lucky girl, and you living at the coast. We have the most beautiful beaches, a warm sea on one side, a freezing sea on the other side. It is just a land of contrasts, a land of beauty, and you've traveled at practically every inch of it. So you are our guest now to tell us about the beauties of South Africa and the sadness that we feel today at the loss of all of that.
Absolutely. Look, it is still an absolutely stunningly beautiful country, as you rightly say. The sad part is really that it's not really a safe country anymore. It was. You could travel quite happily and camp anywhere you liked. No one would ever bother you. The infrastructure has always been very good. Thanks to our forefathers, they set up a very good rail and road infrastructure, airports and so on. And it was a clean, safe, magnificent country. Certainly, that's how I experienced it. Today, it is still beautiful. As you rightly say, there are magnificent beaches, mountains, deserts, forests, very diverse. In a way, I suppose, like a small United States, except, of course, with the African flavor of the big game. The road infrastructure is still reasonably good. It's taking strain. It's not being repaired as well as it should be, but it's still pretty good. The rail infrastructure, unfortunately, has pretty much collapsed. We used to have quite famous luxury trains doing safaris. I worked on them for a while. Train safaris, magnificent way to travel. But that's all gone by the bar now. There are still one or two, but they're much restricted now in where they can go because the rails are not being maintained as well as they should. So that's the downside. But the upside is it's still a very, very good place to visit. It's remarkably cheap if you take the exchange rate into account. When I was in high school, all right, some time ago, but the rand, the South African rand, was worth twice what a dollar was, $2 to the rand. There's now 14 rand to the US dollar at the last time I dared to look. So it's worth 1/28th of what it was when I was in high school. And that's the interesting thing, you know. I'm certainly no liberal, but I like to take a libertarian view, shall we say, and like to try and see all sides and find a balance. And even with all the hype leading up to the takeover of our country by the ANC, led by, of course, Nelson Mandela, even with all the hype about him, Madiba, as he was fondly called, you just had to watch the...
I'm afraid we're going to have this problem, people. But he's worth listening to. I promise you, it's worth hanging in there and listening to this man. He is fabulous. And if you have the opportunity, I guarantee you will love his book. It is a true history of South Africa.
Yes, while he was in, with all the praise singing going on about the wonderful Madiba, Messiah, the money devalued very fast. So the businessmen were obviously not taken in by all this leftist hype. And the reality that a stable, well-run country was now being taken over by essentially a Marxist government didn't sit well with the businessmen. But all the same, the weak currency has encouraged tourism to a large extent, and it's still, as I say, a very cheap place to come. I get a lot of interaction with foreign visitors, and they find our food excellent, our wines superb, and they are half the price of what they're used to paying at home. So it's a pleasure for them to come here. And as long as you stay away from the areas which would be probably dangerous in any country, the worst parts of the big cities, etc., it's reasonably safe as a tourist. And we welcome tourists, and we try to put on a happy face for them, and we're essentially a happy people and a friendly people. I think everyone acknowledges that who comes here. South Africans are essentially very friendly and open people and outspoken people, which is good. Political correctness, I think, is not our forte. So it's a good place to come. It's a good place to enjoy. I would encourage anyone to come here. Kruger Park, much like, I suppose, Yellowstone in the United States, it's a place you have to go. It's a place you have to see. And travel there is pretty straightforward. You can fly from any of the big towns. You don't even have to drive there. Once you get there, you can be picked up by experienced guides, taken around. The accommodations are very good. You will see wonderful stuff. That's the safari side, and then of course the mountains, the beaches, the deserts. You can drive for days on end and just see a different scenario every day, completely different. It's a very diverse country, and it's quite a big country in not really in the American sense, but certainly bigger than any country in Europe. And it's known as sunny South Africa, so your chances of good weather are excellent. So we're still telling people to come, despite any political problems there might be. I think every country's had political problems. I was just about to dash off to Saudi Arabia a little while ago to do a little contract there, and they had a coup. Then I started looking at Spain and Catalonia, and now they've got separatism. So every country has its problems. I wasn't planning on going anywhere near North Korea, but Taiwan, an offer came up, and I think they was within missile shot of what do they call him, Little Rocket Man. So every country has its problems. South Africa certainly does, but I think we have a lot more to offer than most, and I would still encourage people to come here.
Cuan, you talked about the food. That is the one thing I miss so desperately about South Africa. I would do anything for a pie, a steak and kidney pie that you can pick up in every garage in South Africa.
Quite true.
There's nothing like that. Or samosas, or a good curry, or, you know, in South Africa you get it 4 different temperatures, from super mild to sweating yourself to death, you know.
And boerenkos, of course. Boerenkos, farm-style food, yes.
And pumpkins. Yes. Here, pumpkins they're amazing. They're carving pumpkins. They're hollow on the inside, and you don't eat them. I can't believe that you can't get a boere pampun, because what is a Sunday roast without pampun? You know, so these are things that we miss terribly and took for granted when we lived there. And it's such an adventure from the smells, the tastes, the sounds in South Africa are so different, so cosmopolitan, so colorful for people from the rest of the world. We have a polyglot of people there, and such a, it is colorful and noisy, and it smells, the smells of the spices and the cooking. It's an incredible country. I miss it so much.
You're absolutely right. We have 9 provinces and 11 languages, official languages. We have, as you say, our spice markets mainly around Natal, alongside Zululand, Durban, which is where I was born. I still remember fondly going to the Indian market there, the Indian population, a couple of million of them now. They came out about 160 odd years ago as mostly indentured labor, and a lot of them stayed and prospered. They've done very well. And in fact, although the Indians who settled in South Africa were subject to the same restrictive apartheid laws as were black folk, they prospered. In fact, they used it to their own advantage, in the sense that it provided a lot of protection to them against encroachment by the black tribes, because they were given their own areas, and they were able to open businesses, and without much competition from any white folk, because they weren't allowed to open businesses in the Indian areas, etc. So it was kind of a two-way street. It wasn't entirely to their disadvantage, and the Indian community, as they do, I think, even in India, where I've been a couple of times, they concentrate on education, and they made sure that their children got a very good education, and they've prospered. And I think per capita, they probably are the most prosperous single ethnic group in the country. And then we've got our black folk, of course, who are made up of many different tribes. The biggest, I'm telling you stuff you know here, Karin, but I'm selling it for your viewers' sake. The Zulus are the largest single tribe, and they've always been the dominant tribe in terms of numbers and in terms of their own belief that they are a superior tribe. They were a martial state for a century. Eventually, the British broke the back of the Zulu martial state. But either way, they are still today now the most numerous tribe, and they for a couple of decades didn't control the ANC. They were controlled by the second biggest tribe, which are the Xhosa, which Mandela was a member of course, and he certainly wasn't the poor herd boy like the Zulu president we have now. He was born into nobility, Mandela, and he grew up well-educated and studied law, of course. But the Xhosa controlled the ANC for decades. First Mandela, then Mbeki, but before him, chaps like Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, mostly causes, but that's all changed recently. And Jacob Zuma, the current president, is a Zulu, an ethnic, traditional type Zulu, likes to dress up in the leopard skins and dance around. Unfortunately, he tends to sing rather inflammatory songs like "Kill the Boer" or "Pass Me My Machine Gun," and so that's the other ethnic group that I think is probably the most well known, is the Boers. And they slowly evolved in a sense from what were called
I don't really want to jump in here because then I'm talking over Cuan when he comes back. And
yeah, it was getting so good as well.
Mm-hmm.
It was just getting so good as well.
I know. We'll have to ask him to go back and repeat it, I think.
What was essentially a depopulated area, which had been depopulated by the genocide perpetrated by the Zulus on just about every tribe around them. It's estimated that they killed probably 2 million other black Africans, the Zulus, and depopulated virtually the entire interior of southern Africa. And it was into that vacuum, in a sense, that the Boers, the trek Boers as they were called, the traveling farmers, essentially what it means in Dutch is a trek Boer, traveling farmer, and the word trekking comes from that. And they moved into this area, a massive area, and settled and created two good little republics, Transvaal and the Free State, Orange Free State as was known then. And they've sort of evolved in a sense into what are now called Afrikaners, because that's an all-encompassing word now which covers all Afrikaans-speaking white South Africans, and that brings us to what we call the coloured folk. That's what they call themselves, coloured folk. They don't call themselves black. That would be the black African tribes who speak Bantu languages. But the coloured folk, who are essentially mixed-race people, and to a large extent descended from what the only real indigenous people, who were the Hottentots, as they were called then, or the Khoi, and the Bushmen, as they were called, and who still call themselves that, or the Khoi San is the official name. They have assimilated with the coloured folk, and they speak Afrikaans, not any Bantu language. They identify more closely with the white Afrikaners, who also, of course, speak Afrikaans, the Dutch derivative, some German in it, some French, but mostly Dutch, or Flemish, very close to Flemish. So that's the common language of the white Afrikaner and the so-called brown coloured folk, who make up together around about 20% of the population. The whites are now just under 9%, and so are the coloured folk. They're around about there. So with the Indians, probably 2%, about 20%. The rest, 80%, are known as Bantu, or Sub-Saharan Black African, and they speak a variety of languages, about 9 of them, but Zulu being the most common, followed by Xhosa and quite a few others. The ethnicity of the Bantu tribes is very important to them, and their culture and traditions are very important to them. And very fortunately for them, one of the good outcomes of apartheid, the much reviled system of segregation or enforced segregation, is that they got their own homelands, and these are not what would be referred to as reservations in the United States. These are provincial-sized homelands which they own completely, or their chiefs own and control, and disperse the land to those who are in favor. And these homelands were set up by the white nationalist government over a period of about 30 or 40 years, and they were based on what was set up by the British over 100 years ago. They were expanded and they were developed. Infrastructure was put in: airports, roads, dams, schools, airports, hospitals, universities. These were all put in with white taxpayers' money. And this happened over a couple of decades. And so that's one of the good outcomes for the black Africans, is that they have a place to call home. Besides South Africa itself as a country, they have their own homelands where they can go home if they're a Zulu and be a Zulu. They can dress in their traditional gear, eat their traditional food, live in the traditional way, and be amongst Zulus and speak Zulu.
That is the thing about South Africa that's always amazed me, that you go home. So in town where you have your job as a manager, you wear your suit and tie, and you take your BMW and you go home to Zululand during the Christmas and Easter holidays.
As if we're settlers and that we are temporary somehow, although we've been here for 360 years, which is as long as the most of the Europeans have been in America. Yet somehow we considered settlers and made to feel uncomfortable. Even the president, as I mentioned, will dance on stage and sing in Zulu, "Bring me my machine gun, we're going to chase the Boers." And so it's a little bit uncomfortable for white South Africans at the moment. A lot of hostility, a lot of it based on misinformation and false propaganda. We're often told that we stole the land and that should be given back to the black Africans, etc. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nobody stole any land. Anybody who owns land today paid for it, and it changed hands multiple times over the centuries, always for money. So it's not a matter of, I don't know anybody who ever stole any land or got any land for free, for that matter, except black Africans. They got the land for free. They were living in those areas perhaps traditionally, and they were eventually given secure tenure in those lands. So it's all propaganda, unfortunately, to racist propaganda against the white minority. And there's in fact laws now. In fact, there's more laws now based on race than there ever were under the reviled apartheid system. I think there's something like 120 labor laws stacked against the white minority, barring them from the workplace. It's virtually impossible for a white person now to get a job in any kind of government department, etc. So talking as a historian, I see a lot of cycles repeating themselves. There was the genocide of the black Africans by the Zulus in the 1820s or so. There was a self-inflicted genocide of the Xhosa in about the 1850s, quite a strange story, which is in my book, Bulala, which you mentioned earlier, or melded, where a prophetess called Nonkwazi predicted that, or had a vision that a great wind would come and drive the whites into the sea, leaving behind all their fat cattle and their grain stores for the Xhosa, which was Mandela's tribe, of course, and that the sun would rise in the east as it usually does, but it would then set again in the east, and this great wind would come and drive the whites into the sea, and the blacks, to show their belief in this prophecy, were obliged to kill all their cattle, according to her, and eat up all their grain to show absolute faith in this prophecy, and then it would come about. Well, of course, the sun rose in the east on the fateful day, and traveled through the sky as it always had, and set in the west. And the Xhosa realized they'd destroyed their entire livelihood. They'd eaten all their grain, they'd feasted on their cattle, they had nothing left. So starvation set in, and eventually these skeletal tribesmen were coming into the white towns begging for food, and somehow part of the vision, the notion was that the Russians would come and help them drive the whites into the sea. I don't think they realized all those years ago that the whites, Russians, were pretty much whites themselves. But either way, the strange thing was Mandela promised pretty much the same thing to his people as Nonkwazi did. He was from the same tribe, and they had help from Russia, strangely enough, another quirk of history. and that the black Africans expected to just walk into the whites' houses and take them over, take over all their...
Yep, just like that, Cuan. All you have to do is take your little piece of plastic to the bank and you'll get money. People don't seem to understand that you have to put the money in to use that piece of plastic to get it out. You just take the White House car, everything, and it will maintain itself. The fridge will be
back to a week or two. Sorry, are you there?
Yes, we're here. We lost you for a moment, so I just talked over you.
Okay. Are we back online?
Yeah, we're fine now.
Okay. I was just saying that the South Africans are, well, the Afrikaners and the English-speaking South Africans, the white South African minority, less than 10%, less than 9% now, are a resilient people. We've been here 360 odd years. We're not about to go anywhere. I think the message was driven home quite recently. End of October, there was a spontaneous demonstration. It wasn't organized in any way, but thousands and thousands of people got in their cars and their pickups, buckies we call them, and blocked the roads in protest against the murder of our farmers. And it made the government sit up. It made the ordinary folk who weren't perhaps aware that in such a short time and so spontaneously the whites could actually get themselves together and make a show and let it be known that they were not happy with the situation. And it was a revelation. Before, people even deny that there's a so-called genocide on our farmers. A lot of them white liberals who deny this. I read articles about it every day. But this was a spontaneous demonstration by tens of South Africans, tens of thousands of mainly white South Africans, although there were black folk there too, against these farm murders. And just to put it in context, it's estimated, and the figures, as I say, are argued about and tossed to and fro, but it doesn't sound like many, that let's say 4,000, that's the figure I've often seen, of our farmers have been murdered since the ANC got in, which is just in over 20 years, 24 years. That may not sound like a lot, but that is 10% of our farmers. In fact, it's more than 10% now, because our farmers have been leaving the land because it's not a safe profession anymore. They have a higher 3 times higher chance of being murdered than an average South African, who's got a 10 times higher chance of being murdered than the average world citizen. So they've got about a 30 times higher chance of being murdered, a South African white farmer, than your average citizen of planet Earth. And farming is supposed to be a peaceful rural profession. But either way, if that figure is close, and I believe it is, 4,000 of our farmers murdered in just over 20 years, that's 10%. Now, to extrapolate that, there's approximately 2 million farmers in the United States, according to my research. That would be the equivalent of 200,000 American farmers being murdered in 20 years. I think that would be called genocide, and I think people would sit up and take notice. But here, it's swept under the carpet. The police don't want to give racial figures. They only say so many murders, 20,000 a year. They don't break it down, and the government denies that there's anything like an orchestrated attempt to drive our white farmers off the land. But we know it is happening. And as I say, as a historian, I see the context. I see the cycles repeating themselves. 115 years ago, towards the end of the Anglo-Boer War, which went from 1899 to 1902, when the greatest empire the world had ever seen, Britain, invaded South Africa and tried to annihilate the smallest, newest nation on earth, which was the Boers. And it's all about gold and diamonds, nothing to do with...
I hope you'll be back soon. But we have spoken about the Boer War before. We have spoken about the concentration camps. We have spoken about the huge influx of...
so the weight of arms eventually began to overwhelm them, and then but the British still could not subdue these hard-fighting Boers, and they began to then destroy the farms. So we have a cycle here. It's happening again. They burnt down the farms, something like 60,000 farms in those days, far more than they are now. And they destroyed the farmhouses, they burnt the crops, they chopped down the orchards, poisoned the stumps, poisoned the wells, killed the livestock, and took the women and children who were trying to farm while their menfolk were in the field fighting in their commandos. They put them in concentration camps, and approximately half the children of the Boer nation died in those camps. There was about 120,000 people put into the camps, of which it's estimated up to 34,000 died, of which at least half were children under 16. So half the children of the Boers died in those camps, and something like 27% of the entire population. That certainly was a genocide. And the Boers combatants, the commandos who were captured, were shipped off all over the world to distant islands like Bermuda, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to India, to St. Helena Island in the middle of the Atlantic. It was like a Roman invasion where they completely displaced a population, shipped the combatants, captured ones to the furthest corners of their empire, incarcerated all the women and children in the concentration camps. It was an attempt to annihilate the Boer nation by Britain, yet they survived. And here we are 115 odd years later, we're still here. There are some pretty moving descriptions of that war in my book, Bulala. There's some pretty uplifting descriptions of the Boers themselves by their enemies who saw the good in them, and some of them did, and saw that these were people of good moral fiber, etc. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in South African history to read the book. And Bulala, by the way, is a Zulu word, so it's not pronounced Bulala, although it reads that way, but it's Bulala, and it means destroy or kill. And it was the battle cry of the Zulus, and the actual title comes from what was said by the Zulu king Dingaan when he was visited by a group of Boer emissaries in 1838 to sign a land treaty with him. The Boers wanted to live alongside the Zulus peacefully, and the land was pretty much unoccupied, but they thought it would be courteous to visit the Zulu king and inform him that they were moving in as neighbors, and they wanted to be good neighbors. So they sent a delegation along, led by a chap called Peter Retief, and his men, about 70 of them, and they arrived at the Zulu king's kraal, which was called Gungun Klovo, which means swallow the elephant, because the Zulu king, of course, was supposed to be this great man who could literally swallow elephants. I'm sure if he's took his time, he'd work his way through it. But Gungun Klovo was his capital, and they visited there, and they were told that the king would consider what he considered a petition on the condition that they went and recaptured thousands of his royal white cattle, pelted cattle from a rival king who'd stolen them, and then he would consider signing this treaty, and the Boers duly did it.
Yeah, you really, really, really must get a copy of that book, because it's Cuan writes it the way he talks. It's true history, but it's so interesting because it's personal, and it talks about the people. You become part of that.
These horses, yes. So they managed to get them back, and then they delivered the cattle to the Zulu king, and he wanted to know, well, what about the horses? He wants those as well. So the Boers said, well, that wasn't part of the deal, so things started turning a bit sour. And on the day they were supposed to sign and the treaty and leave and become good neighbors, they'd no sooner signed it, and the king himself had signed it, then he shouted out, Bulala Abatsagati, kill the wizards, which is the title of the book. And his bodyguards fell upon these 70 Boers, and there were thousands of his troops standing around, these Zulu warriors, these impis as they were known, this regiment, and they fell upon them, dragged them off to the place of execution. They were brutally executed, and the king then ordered his regiments to fan out and attack the undefended Boer lagers being circled wagons, which they did, and especially in a place called, which was then subsequently named Wienen or Wienen, which means place of weeping, because the Boer wagons were attacked there, mostly women and children, a lot of the children killed, a lot of the women killed, and the servants, colored servants, and they rampaged through what was then Zululand, and part of it called Natal, after the Portuguese explorers named it over Christmas, Natal. And the Boers were virtually wiped out, except for those who did survive, who decided that this king needed to be taught a lesson, and that they were not to be bowed or annihilated. They gathered their strength again. It took a few months to get themselves together, and they decided this time it would be men only who took on the Zulus, and they put together a fighting log as such of about 500 men. The women and children were left behind, well guarded, the survivors, and they moved into Zululand and chose their killing ground, you could say, very strategically, between two rivers, and the Zulus, as expected, attacked them. But the Boers had spent 7 days before this battle praying fervently for a victory, and knowing that they were going to be completely outnumbered. Many things could have gone wrong, but they believed, they were very strong Bible-believing Christians, and they believed that, like the Israelites, they would be preserved by God and the enemy given into their hand, as they put it. And they prayed fervently for 7 days for a victory, and eventually the Zulus did attack them, and it was an army of, between estimates run from 12 to 20,000 Zulus attacked this laager of 500 Boers. And it's as a historian, I take a great deal of interest in military history as well, and I can tell those who are interested in military history, there has been no battle like the Battle of Blood River, as it became known, when the river literally turned red with blood, of Zulu warriors. There's been no battle like that in the history of the world, where one side is so completely outnumbered and yet won the battle hands down. And what made it absolutely remarkable is the Boers did not lose a single man, not a single man. There were a couple who were injured by assegais, spears thrown, or in hand-to-hand combat, including the leader, who was a chap called Andries Pretorius, but they did not lose a single man, and they killed thousands of Zulus. The chances of them even winning the battle were absolutely almost zero, but not only did they win it, they annihilated the Zulu army. So that was a great milestone in the history of the Boers, who, as I say, nowadays are referred more often to.
We've spoken about that battle before, and one of the great things about that have come down to us is that the Zulu warriors afterwards said that they had seen in the sky white horses with warriors on them protecting the laager.
Yes. And they moved in there, and eventually the Boers left. They didn't want to be under British subjugation, so they've had to keep moving, and throughout the history, and eventually settled in, as I say, the Transvaal and the Free State, where they set up two model republics,
which became countries accepted by the rest of the world as actual separate countries. Yes, Ewan?
Yes, they were indeed. They were recognized very much so by the United States. In fact, the United States at that stage was, well, it still is officially, I believe, a republic, and a constitutional republic, and it was recognized by the United States. They had good relations with the United States. They had good relations with Europe, especially with Germany, but never had good relations with Britain, although Britain was forced to recognize them and sign a treaty recognizing their sovereignty, because they tried to invade them in as early as the 1880s, before even vast quantities of gold had been discovered, and the Boers beat them back. So they had to grudgingly accept the sovereignty of these two Boer republics alongside each other, and but they kept an eye on things and waited for their chance. And they stirred up the Zulus against the Boers again, although the British, not too long after that, in fact around about the same period, had a major war with the Zulus. There were a number of mighty battles, including one at Isandlwana, which is well described in the book Bulala, where the rear guard of the British Army became isolated. The main army had gone into Zululand just to subjugate another tribe, as the British did in those days. And the Zulus had rebuilt themselves by then. This is now a good 40 years after Blood River. They had rebuilt their martial state, and they were a mighty army again. And the British went in very confident, and their main army pushed forward right into Zululand, and the Zulus drew them in and cut off the rear guard, which camped overnight without fortifying their position. They were very confident. They didn't expect the Zulus to attack them. They were on their way to attack the Zulus. And that's exactly what the Zulus did. An army of probably 20,000 Zulus descended upon this British encampment, where there were probably 1,500 men, mostly red coats in those days. And the old horns of the buffalo maneuver of the Zulus worked very well, where the experienced warriors in the middle, fleet-footed younger warriors, formed the horns. They encircled this camp, and they absolutely annihilated this British army. It was the worst defeat Britain ever suffered in any of her colonial empires against a native army, you could say. When I say native army, unsophisticated army of locals, and they were absolutely annihilated. The Battle of Isandlwana. And that night, the few straggling survivors who managed to escape from the mayhem of Isandlwana and make their way down to the Buffalo River, along what became known as Fugitive Drift, to a mission station, set up very basic defenses there, expecting to get attacked again, which they were the very same night. But there it was a different scenario altogether, and about 120 British troops and a few Boers who somehow got mixed up in this as transport drivers held off something like 3,000 Zulus, 3,000 or 4,000 for the entire night. And in comparison to the day before's defeat, where one Victoria Cross medal was awarded, 11 were awarded for that night's battle, where they...
Oh dear. I do not like South African technology. I really do not like it, because just as it's getting exciting, I'm breaking a sweat waiting to hear what happens, then we disappear again. I'm afraid, people, that this is just one of the problems of having such fascinating people on.
So,
I'll lose you there for a while.
Yeah, you lost us again.
I've been prattling on about the Battle of Rorke's Drift.
It was going fabulously, and I was about to start biting my nails, and we lost you.
Well, these battles, of course, like any wars, they accelerate the country forward and accelerate the region forward. Although there's often a lot of destruction, a lot of the infrastructure gets destroyed, the country itself it moves forward exponentially, and that's what happened in South Africa, as in many other countries. These great battles and these wars that took place, these attempted genocides, some self-imposed, some perpetrated. The British tried to wipe out the Boers, and they didn't quite succeed, and today we have a similar scenario. I know that's one of the threads of your show, and as a historian, as I see the cycles, this is another one, and there's definitely an attempt now, and I've got articles, I actually downloaded some today, where once again the liberal journalists are denying that there's anything untoward happening in South Africa. But as I mentioned, the figures show the truth, and there's definitely a concerted movement to force the white farmers, the minority, off the land. The politicians are quite open about it. They basically call for genocide of the Boers, and every now and again one of them are taken to the human rights courts or the civil rights courts, and what they're singing or shouting is declared as hate speech, but it doesn't stop them. So I know he's been quoted many times, and I downloaded an article on him as well. It's Dr. Gregory Stanton of Genocide Watch, and he put South Africa at quite an advanced stage towards genocide. He didn't say that it's happening, but he said a number of stages have been passed where the objects or the subjects of the intended genocide are vilified, they insulted, they're called thieves, we stole the land, we're we don't belong here, or we've got past all those stages already. And unfortunately, one of the ANC presidents passed, Becky was his name. He decided to scrap the rural commando system, which had been operating for centuries. It was a voluntary setup which the farmers in those days used. They formed these commandos to protect themselves, protect their districts, to go and get back cattle that had been stolen, etc. So they were basically the rural security, and they're very effective. And the word commando today is widespread all over the world, but that's where it originated. Small groups, highly mobile, self-armed combatants who were essentially farmers, but they knew the land. They were good shots, legendary shots, the Boers, and they would sort out any problems in the rural areas and on the borders. This continued for centuries until the ANC decided that they should scrap these commandos because they perceived them as perhaps too white, although there were black members as well, so they were certainly not whites only, but the government saw it that way, and they disbanded them and disarmed them, and so all of a sudden the farmers in the rural districts had no protection, and the police were supposed to step into the gap, but they didn't, and they never have. And the murders on farms went through the roof exponentially. The figures, as I say, are fudged, they're hidden, they're swept under the carpet, but we know.
Yeah, well, one of the problems with that is that they put on a death certificate that it was natural causes. So you've been shot 7 times in the back and your head lopped off with a panga, and the death certificate says you died of natural causes. So the government is adept at hiding.
Yep, the farmers are really under siege now, our farmers.
Yes, because Cuan, this law has recently been passed, and I believe it's held up in the courts. The one that is land redistribution without compensation. So it's in court at the moment, but Blackland First and the EFF are saying that from the 31st of December, if that law is not promulgated, they are coming for the land by any means necessary. Now, in my opinion, they're already using any means necessary, but this threat is very real. And so of the 30,000 odd commercial farms still working in South Africa, I believe that 20,000 of them are on the market. No hope of selling them, obviously. But people are desperate to get out of farming. So then we go back into a starvation cycle.
You're quite right, Karin. There are something like 20,000 farms for sale. At its peak, South Africa had something like 90,000 commercial farmers, but that's a good 30, 40 years ago. It has dropped steadily, and now they say there's less than 30,000. There were at least twice as many as that when the ANC got in. So our farming numbers have dropped by 50% since the ANC got in, and it shows. The country, South Africa, was a food exporting country. They say at the stage where we had 50,000 commercial farmers, that had already dropped to almost half, they could feed 100 million people, and at that stage South Africa's population was less than 50 million, so we were exporting food on a big scale, basically feeding the whole of Southern Africa. Zimbabwean economy had collapsed, of course, the agricultural economy, precisely because they drove their white farmers, their commercial farmers off the land. Their agricultural economy collapsed, and ironically they flooded into South Africa looking for work on the farms. Anyway, the upshot is that because the farmers have now been so reduced in numbers, South Africa has gone from a food exporting country to a food importing country. In the last 7 years, the whole tide has changed, and South Africa now imports food on a large scale. We don't produce enough now anymore to feed even our own population, let alone major exports, although we do have some exports abroad. But in terms of the balance of trade, in terms of agricultural produce, we are now a net food importing country, and it shows in the cost of groceries. It's still a lot cheaper here than in most first world countries, which we're not anymore, to eat out at restaurants, etc. But buying groceries, I travel a fair bit to the UK and other countries in Europe, and I've seen how in England now, and I was there just little while back, buying basic groceries in the UK is now the same price as buying basic groceries, eggs, milk, butter, etc., bread in South Africa. Yet the UK, they earn at least double on average what South Africans do. So in context, our groceries are now twice the price. So it's starting to show. It's becoming quite expensive now to buy basic farm produce. The farmers are desperately those who are not too old to do anything else. A lot of I think our average age of a farmer is now over 55. Yeah. There's not many youngsters coming in who wants to farm in a profession where what used to be a rural,
safe, quiet life. Cuan, a very safe, quiet life in rural South Africa, and now it's the most dangerous job in the world. It's hard to wrap your head around that. It really is hard to get your head around that. And if they take the farms now without compensation.
So did their great-grandfather. Everybody knows that, but the lie is still perpetrated that that this land was somehow stolen. And these guys are trying to get off the farms now, and it's starting to show. But it's national suicide by starvation. That's what this government is staring in the face. If they don't change their tune and start actively protecting these farmers, perhaps allow them to restart the commando units, insist that they're armed, never mind give them a hard time about getting a permit. The farmers are precious, and they're few in number, and they need to be protected. So there's got to be a whole change of mindset. But as you mentioned, there's an outfit called Black First, Land First, which keeps yelling about invading the farms. There's another outfit called the EFF, led by a Marxist thug called Julius Malema, who also shout about killing the farmers and taking the farms, and they sing songs about it on national TV. Every now and again they get a slap on the wrist from the Human Rights Commission or some court, but they totally ignore it. They'll sing it outside the court again 5 minutes later. So they're absolutely blatant about it. And it's made it very, very uncomfortable and dangerous for our minority farmers, indeed.
But you would think, Cuan, if they look at the example of Zimbabwe, where they've been eating rats, and I mean, the pictures of those rat sellers are frightening. Now Zimbabwe, under this new government, which I have my doubts about, but we're not going there for today, they're asking the farmers to come back. I doubt if any Rhodesian in their right mind would go back to endure that same horrific state of affairs again. But you would think that the ANC had seen from that the country is going to starve, because the farms that have been redistributed to blacks are mostly, there are a few success stories, I admit that, but in general, those farms have been decimated. They are now patches of dirt with nothing growing, and they were huge export places, the tea farms and the Zebedelia citrus farm. Those were enormous income producers for the country, and they are worth nothing today. So have the government learned nothing about feeding their own people?
Karin, it's all about ideology. And same in Zimbabwe, they knew well enough that the white minority were the best commercial farmers. They had production on their per acre in Zimbabwe that were world beaters in the days that it was still called Rhodesia. They had very high production. They had excellent farms, well run, well managed, exporting food, employing people, a thriving agricultural economy. But the ideology of the Marxist African is that the whites are don't belong here, and they're colonialists, etc., and they must get out. And so ideology overrode common sense, and they were whipped up into fervor. Also Mugabe, who thankfully is finally booted out of his palace, he, or one of his many palaces, he's got them all over the world. Well, he of course, once the British withdrew funding, they when they gave them their independence, the deal was that Britain would supply funding.
I'm sorry, people. I really am sorry that this is South African technology for you, and there's not much that anybody can do about it. We try so hard by doing a test before the show, trying to make sure that everything is perfect for our listeners. But unfortunately, we don't live in
we can
South
get
Africa.
into that. But the British government realized that Mugabe was basically buying these farms with their money and giving them to his pals, his politically connected pals, and then they would lease out little patches there. So they were basically farming their own people and getting income from leasing out little patches of land where these guys would try some subsistence farming. So the commercial farming collapsed, and then Britain wisely withdrew its funding, and the whole thing collapsed. And then Mugabe said, well, just take the land. And that was keeping him in power, giving away all this land which he didn't own or didn't have the right to give away. It was basically theft. And of course, the Zimbabwean population of whites was never more than 250,000, more like 230,000 at its peak. It dropped to what is today is about 30,000. So the economy collapsed there. They had the highest inflation in the world. You'd get $1 trillion notes and all sorts of ridiculous things.
With an expiry date on it, Cuan.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Promissory notes with nothing back. Yeah, but no, the government has learned nothing. The ANC has learned nothing from that, absolutely nothing. They're still driven by Marxist ideology. They're still driven by racial hatred of whites, unfortunately. And I'm speaking as a historian, not a politician.
Yes.
I'm not a politician, but I've seen these cycles. I've seen how the ideology has overridden common sense time and again, as per the past genocides or self-inflicted genocides, self-inflicted starvation. This will be self-inflicted starvation. The government is too short-sighted to see that this country desperately needs its farmers, its shrinking pool of highly skilled farmers. South Africa is 70% semi-arid, so it's a very difficult country to farm in. As beautiful as it is, 70% of it would be like Texas in terms of vegetation, so low rainfall, harsh soils, so not an easy place to farm at all. Yet the Boers, Afrikaans name for farmer, have been farming this land for centuries, and they've got it right. And even on dry land farming, they're very productive. Nobody else has got it right, and they're now in big demand, as you quite rightly say. Zimbabwe's now asking them to come back, and Zambia is asking to come back. They were thrown out of those countries, the whites, at some various stages, and now they're begging them to come back and start farming again. Well, they would be foolish, I believe, and also it's only on lease. You can't own the land.
Yes.
And what is to stop the next government coming along and cancelling all the leases as soon as the farm's developed? It's not something that can be done overnight. It takes decades, and especially if you're planting orchards, the trees take many years to mature. It's a lifetime investment. Why should anyone come there with the chance that this will all be taken away from them again, once it's developed and established with their capital on lease and then taken away? So it's a road to nowhere, and until the world gets off its high horse and stops pointing fingers at the white South Africans and calling them racists and colonialists and settlers, and realizes that the white South Africans, who are less than 10% of the population, will be the saviors of this country if they're left to farm, if they're left to their own devices. They are entrepreneurs. They're dynamic and resourceful people. Leave them be. The bad things have been signed away now. We're heading for 30 years since the last of the apartheid laws were scrapped by the whites, incidentally. I'm
going to ask you to go back to that, because that's a very important point, that it was not the ANC government which dismantled apartheid. It was the whites themselves that did that. And it was well underway.
And
Cuan,
pressurizing them.
We lost you for a moment there. You were at a very critical point where you said that apartheid was dismantled by the whites. And please just go back to that, because we lost.
You're absolutely right. It was dismantled by the whites voluntarily, and the last apartheid laws pretty much were scrapped about 30 years ago. And I need to remind American viewers or listeners that Slavery, if we want to go back that far, was scrapped in South Africa in 1834, which is 30 years before it was scrapped in the United States. And segregation here, when forced segregation went on into the 80s, when it went on into the 60s in America, so South Africa was only 20 years behind in that. So those who are holier than us need to look at their own history and realize that these things take time sometimes, and the tides of history don't always move at the same speed everywhere. And so although South Africa was 3 decades ahead of the United States in scrapping slavery, it was 2 decades behind the United States only in scrapping segregation. So these things were part of history. They happened. That's how it was then. To make
that's one of the points that you've made so often with me, and I really think it's important to stress that you cannot judge the 18 and 1900s by today's politically correct standards, because the world operated a different way then. Things that were accepted as just normal. Today you look back and say, oh my Lord, but you can't judge then by now.
No, you can't.
And
History's moved on.
It's very important that we make that clear, because white South Africans today are being judged by standards set 2 centuries ago, and you can't do that.
You're absolutely right. You know, and in a strange sense, as a historian, researching deeply into our history of all the tribes in this country, including my own, I've realized that the methods used by my ancestors, although they seemed heavy-handed in many cases, were not nearly as heavy-handed as the methods that were used against them by their own kinfolk sometimes, the British. Not nearly as heavy-handed as the methods used by the Zulus against them, for instance. As I say, today there are more racist labor laws than there ever were under apartheid, and they're all aimed at the minority. So I think this is the only country in the world, I certainly hope it is, and I hope it won't last as it is, that the affirmative action is in favor of the majority. It's not there to help along minorities. It's there to somehow push the majority ahead. And we've got even what we call BEE, Black Economic Empowerment. I've never heard of WEEE, White Economic Empowerment. Yeah. So we've got all these strange laws now, which are racist laws, and yet somehow they're acceptable because they are in favor of the black majority against the white minority, who are supposed to suffer now for the sins of their forefathers. My wife and I have a son of 22. We have a number of children, but the youngest is 22, and he's trying to do a degree at a Cape Town.
Oh dear. Yeah, the BBE laws, which affect even high quality students, white students and Indian students. You can have the highest marks in the country and yet not get a place in the university because
he somehow is supposed to feel guilty for being white.
Go back. You just said where he's trying to do a degree at university, and yes. These are important things for the world to hear from somebody who's going through it himself.
Well, this poor young fella, he's trying to do a technical degree, and his campus has been burnt down 3 times in the last 2 years. Yeah. By radical black students who destroy all the lecture halls, they destroy all the equipment, all the computers, and they go on about white privilege. And he and his cousin, who's also trying to study, and she's trying to study architecture at a Cape Town university. She actually asked us the other day, how do I answer these radical black students when they tell me about white privilege? What are they actually talking about? And I said to her, they're talking nonsense, because your father, their father, had to work very hard as basically a laborer cleaning carpets at one stage of his life. He then got into the building business. He's now extremely well off, and he worked to get that. There was no privilege, and he obtained all that success under these new so-called labor laws. Well, they're just apartheid laws in reverse, in a sense. So somehow he managed to get that right without any privilege. He had to pay for his own education. I had to pay for my own education. My father had to pay for his own education. These black students are getting education for free, and yet they are burning down the campuses. So there's something badly wrong in the mentality of our majority of our people in this country. They have a sense of entitlement. And in the same way, I suppose that in the United States, there's still people complaining about slavery, which ended 150 years ago. And the answer is always, well, your dad didn't pick any cotton and my dad didn't own any slaves, and neither did our grandfathers. Yeah. So what are we arguing about? We've got the problem now that apartheid, which ended 30 years ago, will be no doubt used as a cudgel to beat the white minority over the heads for I don't know how many centuries to come. Yeah. So we need to move forward. We need to move forward. Otherwise, this country will be destroyed. Our fine universities, which were highly regarded all over the world, are now shambolic. And it's a great shame. The standard of education has dropped remarkably. There's no real future, or doesn't appear to be, for young white people in this country. They're discriminated against in the labor market. They're discriminated against at the universities. They're vilified. They're attacked. So a lot of them are leaving. Of our children, most have left. They've gone to Australia, they've gone to the United Kingdom, and I can't blame them because
if they can, Cuan, but that's the other thing.
If they can,
because the world refuses to take whites out there in general. There are, I'm not there and Mel's not there, so obviously the world has taken us. But in general, it is extremely difficult for a white South African to leave the country.
It is indeed. Those professionals who, like doctors and dentists and engineers and accountants, who were in demand, their professions were in demand in countries abroad. They were pretty much welcomed in. And if you go to the UK now, for instance, your chances when you go to a doctor or dentist of seeing a South African doctor or dentist is pretty good. Canada is the same. So a lot of our top people have left, but there's a lot of good people still here.
Yeah, I was one of the people who was able to marry an EU national in order to be able to, leave South Africa permanently and have opportunities abroad. So I still have a South African passport. Trying to get rid of that is very difficult.
And the young folk especially are feeling the heat, in the sense that they are discriminated against for so-called or real or imagined sins of their forefathers, which they can do nothing about. The kids who are in university today weren't even born when Mandela was released, yet somehow they're blamed for whatever happened before that and discriminated against, and the chances of getting a good job when they leave the university with their degrees, which are already watered down degrees, are slim. So a lot of them are also leaving, which is a great shame. So we've got problems. In the historical context, we will come out of it. If I look at what we've been through before, this country, we will come out of it, but not without a few bruises, and it's unnecessary. We have people who are really keen to pull this country right and to do the right thing and to be good citizens. They're pretty keen, yet our politicians, unfortunately, and I'm not one, I'm a historian, but I'm looking at them in context, they are corrupt as the day is long. And every book you read exposing the corruption is just worse than the one before. So fortunately, it was a very wealthy country, otherwise it would have collapsed long ago. But they're hollowing it out like termites, and eventually the pillars that are holding it up, are starting to crack. So we're hoping, as patriotic South Africans or South Africans who love our country, that foreign governments who do run the show well, like your own, will put a little bit of pressure on this government to say, look, you're letting things slide there, and we don't want to see a good country go to waste. So you really need to start getting some law and order. You need to start clamping down on corruption. This country was subject to very, virulent sanctions during the days of apartheid because countries abroad didn't agree with the policies. We've got far worse policies in many ways now, discriminatory policies. We've got far more corruption, far more. So I don't see why there's two sets of rules. If there was pressure put on the government in those days because people didn't agree with their policies, it should be the same today. And perhaps then they would sit up and notice. But at the moment, they're just running riot and looting the country, unfortunately.
Cuan, recently, what really shocked me was a British politician, and I don't remember her name right now. She was at the UN a couple of weeks ago, and she stood up and she demanded that they put the farm murders on the agenda. And she said, I know you're not going to vote for this, but I'm telling you, you need to pay attention. And they voted her down. And she came back a second time and said, I demand that you pay attention to this. And they voted her down a second time. It is shocking that they don't even want to put it on the agenda for discussion. So don't tell me that the rest of the world doesn't know about this. They know damn well, and they're just turning their backs on it. I'm infuriated by that.
It's scandalous, it's shameful, it's immoral. And I think where some of it comes from, Karin, is that there was such a hype to bring in this ANC all over the world. There were music concerts, there were songs written and sung, there was great movements and
the lighter waving in the air, you know, against apartheid. We'll wave our lighters, and I refuse to do Sun City and so on. Yes, it was huge, and now they're embarrassed and won't come and look back. I'd love to hear Cuan's view on this, but once more, we've lost him. I'll ask him to go back. Cuan, we lost you again.
Okay. I think we were talking. Yes.
I think we were against it.
Yes. The fact that people are ignoring it today is immoral and it's scandalous. And I think where some of it comes from is the fact that there was such a huge movement in days past against the white minority government here. Everybody believed that they had the moral high ground, and there were music concerts and songs were sung and songs were written and plays were staged, and it was the flavor of the day. And sanctions were imposed, and I don't think they realized, unfortunately, that they were promoting scoundrels. And they were scoundrels then and they're scoundrels now. They're a Marxist-inspired terrorist organization. They haven't settled down to become a legitimate government. They are a democratically elected government because the majority of the people always supported them in this country. But they were scoundrels then and they're scoundrels now. They know it. We know it. The rest of the world is starting to learn, and I think they feel a little bit shamefaced that they actually were so instrumental in putting these people in, that there were no guarantees, no protection whatsoever for the minority who controlled the country and ran it and managed it very well, sometimes heavy-handedly, sometimes not heavy-handedly enough. But that government handed over democratically to a new government composed of a democratically elected majority black government who've turned out to be absolute scoundrels. And I think the people who supported them in those days and had all these music concerts and these anti-apartheid movements and all that, they meant well, most of them, and we shouldn't condemn them for that. They meant well, but they were ill-informed, they were ignorant, they were idealistic, took the romantic view. They didn't realize, I think, most of them, that they were promoting scoundrels. And the white South Africans, although people found the laws in those days repugnant, and many of them were, the people themselves were not bad people. And in fact, you know, it might surprise a lot of people if they do their research, which most people don't, is that the nationalist government, the white nationalist government in those days, the apartheid government, let's call them that, they very seldom got more than half the vote. There was always a very strong body of South Africans who voted against them. It's just that the opposition was split in many directions, as it often is. And so they were never able to get together and actually vote these people out. But it was only in the height of the the armed insurrections and the communist pincer movement to take South Africa, supported by China and Russia in those days, or the Soviet Union, that the nationalist government actually gained a majority vote, because then everybody felt threatened, and they'd realized what we were fighting. We were not fighting black people. We never were. We were fighting communists. And unfortunately, that never got through to the liberals of the West. They thought they were supporting human rights. But under today's government, all human rights are paper rights, because if you have no safety, you have no protection. If the criminals run riot, if the police are corrupt, then there are no human rights. So, as I say, I think a lot of the resistance now to actually putting pressure on this government is because people feel a little foolish that they actually put these people in power, and now they've realized what they've done, and that Zimbabwe was, or Rhodesia, Zimbabwe was the canary in the coal mine. That canary was choked and strangled long ago. Now.
Yeah, brilliantly put that, actually. South Africa pretty much hit it the same way as Zimbabwe.
Yeah, here we are. And the next thing I would like to ask when Cuan gets back to us is about the agricultural and mining, because those are the mainstays.
The greatest national parks. We had amongst the best medical services in the world. First heart transplant performed in South Africa. We were at the cutting edge. Now we're just a third world country. A beautiful one, admittedly. A beautiful country, which we love, but it's a third world country now, and all it took was 30 years. So I think those people who were instrumental in bringing this about are feeling a little foolish. Yes, and that's probably something to do with it. They don't want to admit that they actually were mistaken. Not in everything. We can't just sweep aside all their well-meant motivations. Some of them were very good motivations, and they were they believed they had the moral high ground, and they led the ANC to believe that they had the moral high ground because of all the support. But the ANC have always been scoundrels. I'm saying it straight as a historian. I've got nothing against them personally. I've incidentally never voted for the white nationalist government ever. I always voted for whatever opposition party I could find, because I always thought a protest vote is good. It keeps the government on their toes. So one could never accuse me of voting or supporting the apartheid government, not at all. And I certainly didn't oppress anyone. And I've always got along very well with people of all races. I've lived in Africa, I've lived in India, amongst a massive majority of folk who are not like me, and I've always got along with them very well, because I respect them and I respect their culture. But unfortunately, our culture now as white South Africans is not being respected. Our history has been twisted and distorted. That's why I urge people to read this book, Bulala, which is easily available in America, by the way, easily available all over the world. On Amazon in America, you can get it directly from the publisher. The first edition was published there. So I would urge them to read it, because it gives from a perspective of someone who lived through the apartheid era, but who also takes an interest in the earlier history of our country and how this country was forged. And there's a lot of correlations with the United States, a lot, which I think they will find interesting. And without having read a book which in a nutshell gives you South African history in an easily readable form, it's difficult for people to actually grasp the bigger picture. And I think it's important that they do read it, and not just so I sell more books, but so that people get a clearer view of what this country is about, because all they've ever got is the liberal leftist media point of view, which is completely distorted. It's disingenuous, it's false, it's fake news, as they say these days, and it always has been. So I would urge them to read reliable books on South Africa, and I believe mine is.
It is most definitely that, Cuan. You know, you can see my copy. It's tattered and marked everywhere, because that's if I'm preparing for a show, I'm okay. So, I'd like you to talk about the two mainstays of the economy. We've talked about agriculture. Now, that was one of the biggest income producers for South Africa. The other one is mining.
Yes.
Now, South Africa was built on that. The wars were fought about it. But today, there is talk of a law that you must give 71% of your mining shares to not sell, to black people. Now, Cuan, you, from a historic point of view and also from a living in South Africa point of view, that will destroy the economy, totally. There will be nothing left. I think we've lost him again. I see him frozen with his eyes shut. As he said, you must read his book, because Mel and I's hardest task is giving the correct history of South Africa, to transpose that with the lies that you have been fed throughout your life about what happened in South Africa. And Cuan's book gives you the absolutely correct, but in such an easy read and such a pleasure to read. You must really just go with it. It's fun. Cuan, if they do this with the mines, we have already had so many big companies leaving South Africa this year because of junk status of the economy. If they try and do that, and the nationalization that Malema is talking about, nationalize the banks, the building societies, the insurance companies, South Africa's done, because foreign companies will just not invest.
You're absolutely right, Karin. We have shamefully been reduced to junk status, below investment level. I believe under that, under most countries' laws, they may not invest things like pension funds and other people's money in a country that doesn't have the correct status, and we've now fallen below that. So we can expect a big outflow of foreign capital. Shameful for a country that, as I say, when I was a younger man, our rand was worth double what the US dollar was. It's now worth 1/14th. So it's 1/28th of the value of what it was when I was younger, under the bad old days. But there we go. But a shocking figure, which I read in a book on the economy that I was reading the other day, says that South Africa has lost 50% of its manufacturing capability under the ANC in just over 20 years. In other words, 50% of the factories have closed down. 50% of the mines have closed down. And as you rightly say, this talk of giving shares and giving only to black people, it's absolutely racist nonsense, and all based on this grab and entitlement ideology, this Marxist thinking. It would be absolutely disastrous. Mining is hard work and highly skilled work. Leave it to the experts. It was a huge employer of labor, and they earned more than most because of the nature of the work. Where these mines have been given with taxpayers' money, there was a very prominent case recently of a gold mine which was highly productive, one of the most productive gold mines in the world, which was bought from the original owners with taxpayers' money through the Industrial Development Corporation, I think it was, where they took taxpayers' money and they bought this mine, and then they divvied it up to all these connected black-only political types who had showed some promise of some business acumen. They ran it for a few months, and then they stopped paying the miners. They sold their shares and ran off with the money, and those who stayed started chopping up the headgear and all the equipment and selling it off for scrap. So a highly productive gold mine went from one of the top mines in the world to scrap, with thousands of miners out of jobs and hadn't been paid for months, in a matter of 6 months. It was unbelievable. It was an absolute travesty, and it made it a few of the more prominent miscreants were charged with various commercial crimes, which all dropped away.
Yes, that's another amazing thing that happens in South Africa. If you are rich and powerful enough, I'm seeing the same thing in the States right now, but if you're rich and powerful enough, somehow 800 crimes just disappear, because our illustrious president has over 700.
These are ragged poor people who are scratching in these mines when there were big corporations running them efficiently. that's the result of these crazy policies which this government has, and it's all ideology based. There is no financially sound fundamentals to their thinking, and it's all grab as much as you can now. There was a very big shortage at one stage a couple of years ago of electricity supply. We were having what they called rolling mass blackouts and all that, and people were buying generators and putting on solar panels and all that. And then they started desperately building power stations because they'd been warned for 15 years they needed to build more power stations as the population grew, and they never did a damn thing. They just spent all the money that they did get in. And eventually it caught up with them, and there was a shortage of electricity supply, and a lot of factories had to close down, smelters, etc. Now there's a surplus, even though these mines are no longer operating. They don't need the electricity, so there's actually a surplus. We've lost 50% of our mines and our factories, so there's actually a surplus, although these big power stations are still being built. They're 3 or 4 years behind schedule, most of them, and billions of rands or dollars over budget, so they still haven't come online, or they've half come online, but we actually don't even need them now because the demand has dropped so much because of all the closures on the factories and the mines. So it's not a good situation at all. And the only other big employer, as you mentioned, was agriculture, and we were talking about that earlier. That's heading into a disaster zone. So tourism seems to be the up-and-coming employer. A lot of tourism and a lot of... Yes.
That busload of Dutch tourists was attacked. Those Brits were attacked the other day as the airports. They are killing off their only source of income.
Yeah,
it's shocking.
Strangling the golden goose. Yep,
it is shocking. I'd like you to, however, to talk about the fact that yes, it's a black government, but their own people are suffering so badly under this that they are talking about wanting apartheid back.
You know, I think it's used as a foil. You know, about all this human rights and restoration of land and all that. It's a foil. This government doesn't care a hoot about their own people. Absolutely none. They're just grabbing as much as they can. They're blatant about it. Whenever the electorate get a little bit uneasy, and when they see the extent of the corruption and the mismanagement and the incompetence, and they start getting a bit uneasy, then the government just promises them land, just exactly like they did in Zimbabwe. The population gets restless. They say, don't worry, we're going to confiscate the land without compensation and give it to the people, and all this Marxist nonsense. You know, I think it was Edmund Burke, the Irish philosopher, who was a very clever man, and he's the one who said things like, all it takes for good men, evil men to succeed is for good men to do nothing. That Edmund Burke. He rated Karl Marx as a third-rate intellect, and I'm tending to agree with him, because I see the result of this Marxist thinking all over the world. It is an absolute disaster, and all this nonsense about, it hasn't been applied properly. Well, wherever it's been applied,
And just to say, Karl Marx was a Jewish Freemason, and as far as you know, a pedophile, child abuser, and Luciferian, very much into the occult. So this is the ideology behind social communism that has now been embedded upon the world.
Land. They don't want to work the land. The farming is hard work in the baking sun and the freezing cold. Yes. They like the city bright lights. So this is all just ideological nonsense. And strangely enough, the overthrow of the Zimbabwean dictator Mugabe recently, they say one of the things that triggered it, it's such a strange thing, was on social media. One of his spoiled sons was in Johannesburg, and he apparently filmed himself pouring Mouton Chiron champagne over his $60,000 Breitling watch. And the caption he put there was, "You can do this when your daddy owns the country." And apparently that got the young folk in Zimbabwe who were struggling to find jobs, got them absolutely livid, and it added to the momentum of his overthrow. But this is the kind of ostentatious consumerism that we do get, where we get this, for instance, this EFF, they call themselves the Economic Freedom Fighters, and Julius Malema, the radical Marxist leader, who's a township thug actually, and he drives around in a flashy BMW. He wears a Breitling watch. You know, they love the bling. They love the consumerism. They're not communists. It's all used, this communist talk, this Marxist talk, as a foil to con the illiterate into thinking that these guys are somehow intellectuals, and they're coming up with all this amazing Marxist ideology that's going to create a workers' paradise. Yeah. Well, you know the old saying, communism is always only just one genocide away from utopia. Yeah. And I think it's a rather sad saying, but it's essentially true.
So, do you think that the huddled masses see in Malema, if they could just get one toe on that gravy train, they could be him? Do you think that is the attraction? Because that's what I think.
So.
I think that
you're right.
Is what they could be if they got just a little bit of political power.
That's it. I think you've hit the nail on the head. A government job these days in South Africa is a ticket to wealth. A third of the fiscus goes to paying their salaries. They're extremely highly paid, so-called civil servants. I haven't heard anybody call himself a civil servant for a long time. They're not in service.
And they don't serve.
Exactly. They're not in service, they're in power. Yeah. And a government job is a ticket to wealth, a ticket to nepotism, a ticket to absolute largesse. And I think you hit the nail on the head. These flashy politicians in a way inspire, as you call them, the huddled masses, the people who have no education and no skills and no nothing, living in a shack. They think, I also want a BMW and a Breitling watch, and if I can get a government job, I'll have those things just like these guys. So yes, I think that does inspire them. Unfortunately, that is not acquired through honest toil. What they've acquired is through corruption and theft, essentially. So the old saying, a fish rots from the head, and that's what we've got. We've got a rotten government. The example that they're setting for the electorate is a foul one. You know, the old president.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Just as it starts getting very interesting, and I'm dying to hear what's next, then he disappears. Yeah.
Well, we're coming up to 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I know. The minute he comes back, I'll ask him to go back on that, and then
what will replace it is questionable.
Exactly. Whatever replacement we have next, I don't see it, as in Zimbabwe right now, I don't see that a replacement is going to be an improvement. Because...
Well, Zimbabwe, sorry, Karin.
Yeah, no, go ahead, because we've only got about 10 minutes left. We need to...
Okay. Zimbabwe, what we've got there at the moment is we have it's essentially a palace coup, because the party is still the same. It's ZANU-PF. They have Mnangagwa now. He was known as the crocodile for good reason. And I think they just wanted to get their hands on the loot. Yeah. I'm hoping that they won't be as bad as Mugabe. I don't think that's even possible. But I don't see that there's going to be a sudden improvement. And what I fear is, and I think, unfortunately, I might be right, is that we're going to get tribalism rearing its ugly head again. Because don't forget that Mugabe is a Shona, and they were the majority tribe, although they were always the subject tribe to the Ndebele. And during their freedom war, the Ndebele and the Shona cooperated. But in the historical context, the Ndebele, who were essentially Zulus, a renegade General Masilikatsi, who fled from Shaka Zulu with stolen cattle, he just kept going and eventually clashed with the Boers, and the Boers drove him across the Limpopo River into what was then Rhodesia, or became Rhodesia, and they subjugated the resident Shona tribe. And it was only when democracy came along that the tribe with the higher population got in control, and that was Mugabe's bunch, the Shona. So they took control democratically, excuse me. But when there was a bit of an insurrection in the south of Zimbabwe by the Matabele or Ndebele, excuse me, Mugabe sent in North Korean trained troops, and they massacred something like 20,000 of these in the belly and threw their bodies down the old mine shafts. So that hasn't been forgotten. That was in the 80s. And I do believe that the Ndebele, who are still the minority, although they were always the dominant tribe and historically, they may see this as an opportunity to try and get back in power. In the same way that the Zulus in South Africa, who were always the dominant tribe, who were then, unfortunately for them, subject to democracy, and they became second stringers until they got their man back in power, who is Zuma, who's a Zulu. And they're not going to let anybody in. So I think we might see a similar scenario there, where I don't know if ZANU-PF, the ruling party, will be taken over by tribalism, but certainly I think you're going to get a very strong opposition coming up there in the south, mainly voted in by the Ndebele, who will vote in one of their own. And I think we're going to get some problems there. And based on tribalism, because that hasn't gone away. To their credit, the Bantu tribes in South Africa anyway, they all got together pretty much and voted the old whiteys out. So to their credit, they did stand together when they needed to, when it came to a democratic vote. But given a chance, they tend to fall back on tribalism. And the move is now to get Zuma out here. He's becoming unpopular. I mean, even his ostentatious shows of wealth are starting
to irritate the people around him badly. Yes. And they're talking of bringing those charges back and having him go to have his day in court. But his plan, the same as Mugabe's was to replace him with an ex-wife of his, and Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. So it's going to be a very interesting year heading up to the elections.
Certainly. Yep.
I'm really sorry that we've lost Cuan at the last minute. You back, Cuan? No, we've lost him. I'd love him to say some closing words, but on behalf of myself and Mel, I hope you enjoyed the show. We will have Cuan on again, because you can never cover all of this in a 2-hour show, and he tells it in a way that nobody else can. It's the most amazingly interesting way of telling a story. And I have to admit that I copy him. I take bits out of his book and I act them out on the show, like the people marching along with their red coats and their white pants with a drummer boy and a cloud of dust behind them, directly out of Cuan's books. And it appears to me that people throughout the world enjoy that way of doing things, painting pictures for them. So thank you, Cuan. You have given me inspiration and you really helped me along this road.
He's muted. Cuan, you're muted.
Yeah. Sorry, his mic is muted. We can't hear him.
Thank you. Any closing words, Cuan? We're about to end off the show.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be with you, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly have, and I would encourage your viewers to read Bulala if they want a good idea of what this country is about.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cuan.
Absolute privilege to have you with us. We've, I've been nagging Karin for some time. Please, time to get Cuan on, and you finally came and joined us. And we would love to have you back to carry on more of your information and a very colourful way of portraying what's really happened in South Africa in the past and in present, as well as getting an understanding of what we think could be happening in the future. So I really appreciate your input. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, folks, I think we're heading towards the end of the show. Karin, as always, my most esteemed colleague, it's been wonderful to have you co-hosting and leading this particular interview. And Cuan, we will have you back. Thank you very much for your work and for everything you've done to put out the information. We need more people out there who are willing to actually explore this stuff and do the research. So please, guys, never stop learning. Get into the true history of South Africa. Understand what's going on. And you know what? if enough people actually get an understanding of what's going on internationally, perhaps the international community will actually sit up and see what's really happening in South Africa, because it's an absolute travesty. One of the most beautiful countries in the world, and really it's just been absolutely decimated by bad politics, lots of corruption, violent crime. Need I say more? On that note, let's end the show. Thanks to everybody who's been with us tonight. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back same time, same place, probably an hour later next week. But but this has been Stop South African Genocide on CCN. Please check out the archive on ccn.media, and of course, check out the other shows. All shows are listed on our main website, which is consciousconsumernetwork.tv. And of course, please do go check out the sovereignstateofgoodhope.org website and support the secession of the Sovereign State of Good Hope. We honestly believe that this is one of the few options that we have to regain self-determination in South Africa, and we're certainly backing it here. Okay, guys, that's it. Thank you very much. Good night.
Night.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire: the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.